The massive orbital station of Kepler Prime floated like a silver jewel against the star-speckled darkness of space. Thousands of lights twinkled across its surface as the greatest military gathering in galactic history took place. Ships from every corner of the known universe had come to show their power, their weapons, and their strength. Admiral Kethvar stood on the command bridge of his flagship, the Shadowbane, watching the incredible display before him. His red eyes gleamed with pride as he looked at his own fleet. 24 Zephyrian dreadnoughts stretched out in perfect formation, each one over a kilometer long. Their dark metal hulls bristled with plasma cannons and missile tubes. Blue energy crackled along their weapon systems, creating an electric light show that made other species step back in fear. The Zephyrians were known throughout the galaxy as the strongest military force. Their ships could destroy entire planets, and their armies had conquered hundreds of star systems. Kethvar's chest swelled with pride as smaller alien vessels moved carefully around his massive warships, giving them plenty of space. "Look at them scatter like frightened fish," he said to his second-in-command, pointing at a group of trader ships that quickly changed course to avoid his fleet. Commander Vex Thul, a 7-foot-tall reptilian warrior with scales that shifted color in the light, nodded in agreement. His clawed hands moved across the control panel as he monitored the dozens of different fleets surrounding them. "The turnout is impressive this cycle, Admiral. Even the crystalline hegemony brought their war forms." Kethvar turned his attention to the strange, pulsing shapes floating nearby. The crystalline beings didn't build ships like other species. Instead, they grew them from living crystal that could think, feel, and fight on its own. The bioships looked like massive jellyfish, made of rainbow-colored crystal, their transparent bodies filled with swirling energy. Tentacles made of solid light reached out from their cores, each one capable of slicing through steel like butter. When they moved, the bioships left trails of sparkling dust that made space itself seem to sing. On the other side of the formation, the mechanical collective had arranged their vessels in perfect geometric patterns. Their war cubes were exactly what the name suggested, massive metal boxes covered in sensors, weapons, and robotic arms. Each cube was the same size, the same color, and moved with the same mechanical precision. No emotion, no style, just pure mathematical perfection. The robots inside never slept, never felt fear, and never showed mercy. "Impressive indeed," Kethvar agreed, watching as a squadron of fighter craft performed aerial stunts between the larger vessels. "Though I noticed the Flame Dancers brought fewer ships this time. The Flame Dancers were a species that looked like living fire, and their ships were just as wild. Red and orange vessels twisted through space like dancing flames, leaving trails of actual fire behind them. Their pilots were known for being crazy enough to fly straight into enemy fire, screaming battle songs as they attacked." Vex Thul checked his scanner readings. "Intelligence reports suggest they lost significant forces in the border wars. The Void Hunters hit them hard." At the mention of the Void Hunters, both aliens felt a chill. Those dark ships lurked at the edge of the gathering like shadows, barely visible against the black of space. Nobody knew much about the species that flew them, except that they seemed to feed on fear and destroyed everything they touched. "At least the singing crystals decided to attend," Kethvar said, gesturing toward a cluster of ships that hummed with beautiful music. The crystal beings created vessels that looked like massive musical instruments, and when they flew together, they produced sounds so beautiful that even hardened warriors stopped to listen. The display continued for hours. Ships of every size, shape, and color filled the space around Kepler Prime. Some looked like giant insects, with wings that sparkled in the starlight. Others resembled sea creatures from ancient oceans, complete with tentacles and fins that moved as if swimming through water instead of vacuum. A few species had built their vessels to look like enormous flowers, their petal-like hull sections opening and closing as they maneuvered. "Wait," Vex Thul said suddenly, his scales darkening as he focused on his tactical display. "What is that pathetic formation approaching from the outer rim?" Kethvar turned to look at the scanner, squinting at the readings. Far out at the edge of sensor range, 12 tiny dots were moving slowly toward the station. They were so small that the computer had almost classified them as debris. "Scanners show they're artificial," Vex Thul reported, his voice filled with confusion. "But they're smaller than most shuttlecraft. Each one is barely 200 meters long. For comparison, Kethvar's flagship was over 1,200 meters from nose to tail. Even the smallest warships in the gathering were at least 400 meters long. These approaching vessels looked like toys in comparison." The communication system crackled to life with a calm, steady voice. "Kepler Prime Control. This is the Terran Diplomatic Corps requesting docking clearance. Ambassador Kim Jiho aboard the lead vessel." The entire command center fell silent for a moment. Then laughter began to ripple through the alien crews. It started as quiet chuckles but grew louder as the news spread from ship to ship across the fleet. "Terran?" Kethvar asked, still laughing. "I've never heard of this species. Database shows. They're from a small blue planet in the outer spiral arm," Vexthul said, checking his computer. "Recent addition to galactic civilization. Barely discovered faster than light travel 50 of their years ago." The laughter grew even louder. A species that had only been traveling between stars for 50 years was trying to attend a military exposition with 12 ships that looked like children's toys. It was like watching a group of ants try to join a gathering of dragons. "Shall I tell them to turn around and go home before they embarrass themselves further?" Vexthul asked, his scales now bright with amusement. Kethvar wiped tears from his red eyes. "No, let them dock. This should be entertaining. I want to see what these humans think they can contribute to a gathering of real military powers." The 12 tiny ships continued their slow approach toward Kepler Prime, completely unaware that thousands of alien warriors were watching them and laughing at what they saw as the most pathetic display of military might in galactic history. The Grand Assembly Hall of Kepler Prime stretched out like a massive cathedral made of gleaming metal and crystal. The ceiling soared hundreds of meters above, covered in holographic stars that showed the real-time positions of every fleet in the galaxy. Thousands of seats arranged in circular tiers faced a central platform where speakers could address the gathering. The air hummed with translation devices working overtime to convert hundreds of different languages into something everyone could understand. Representatives from across the known universe filled the hall, each delegation more impressive than the last. The Zephyrian section buzzed with activity as Admiral Kethvar stood before a massive holographic display showing his recent victories. The three-dimensional images rotated slowly, showing burning cities and surrendering fleets in vivid detail. "Behold the conquest of the Altair system," Kethvar announced, his voice booming through the hall's speakers. 7 planets, 43 moons and over 2 billion inhabitants now serve the Zephyrian Empire. Their resistance lasted exactly 4 hours against our superior firepower. The hologram shifted to show his dreadnoughts firing plasma beams that could melt through asteroid belts. Explosions bloomed like deadly flowers across the display as enemy ships were vaporized in seconds. The assembled aliens nodded appreciatively, some taking notes on the weapon systems they observed. Across the hall, the crystalline Overmind's representative floated above its seating area like a living rainbow. The creature had no solid form, instead appearing as a constantly shifting cloud of colored light that pulsed with each word it spoke. When it was their turn to present, the entire hall filled with beautiful music that made even the most violent species feel peaceful. "We have brought 17 star systems into perfect harmony," the Overmind sang, its voice like crystal bells ringing in the wind. "Where once there was chaos and suffering, now there is only unity and peace under our guidance." The holographic display showed worlds being transformed by crystalline growth, their surfaces becoming gardens of living gem that sparkled within a light. Cities of crystal rose from the ground like flowers blooming in fast forward, while the native populations walked among them with glowing eyes that showed they had been joined to the collective consciousness. The mechanical collective's presentation was entirely different. Their robot representatives stood perfectly still as data streams flowed across multiple screens. No emotions, no grand speeches, just pure mathematical efficiency displayed in charts and graphs. "Productivity in conquered sectors has increased by 347%, the robot announced, in a voice that sounded like grinding gears. "Biological inefficiencies have been eliminated. Resistance has been calculated and found to be 0.0003% effective against our forces." The display showed worlds being strip-mined by massive mechanical harvesters, their resources converted into more robots and warships with clockwork precision. Every movement was calculated, every resource accounted for, every life reduced to numbers on a spreadsheet. Other species took their turns showcasing their power. The Flame Dancers presented videos of their pilots performing impossible aerial maneuvers while destroying enemy formations. Their ships twisted through space like living fire, leaving trails of actual flames that burned even in the vacuum of space. The Void Hunters remained silent, but their mere presence cast shadows that seemed to swallow light itself. The singing crystals performed a battle hymn that told the story of their victories through pure music, while the hive minds showed their ability to coordinate millions of individual creatures into perfect unity. Each presentation was more impressive than the last, demonstrating the vast military might that controlled the galaxy. Then came the moment everyone had been waiting for. The human delegation was called to present. A small section near the back of the hall had been reserved for the newcomers. 3 figures sat there, looking almost comically small compared to the massive aliens surrounding them. Ambassador Kim Ji-ho was a middle-aged man with graying hair and kind eyes, wearing a simple blue uniform that looked plain next to the elaborate armor and ceremonial robes of other delegates. Captain Park Min-ho sat to his right, younger and more serious, his military bearing obvious even while seated. Lee Hyeri, the diplomatic attaché, was a woman in her 30s, with an easy smile and alert eyes that seemed to take in everything around her. When their name was called, Kim Ji-ho rose calmly and walked to the central platform. The contrast was striking. This ordinary-looking human standing where mighty alien warlords had just displayed their power to conquer worlds. Some delegates had to lean forward to even see him properly. "Honored delegates," Kim began, his voice clear and steady despite the vastness of the hall. "Earth appreciates this opportunity for dialogue and peaceful exchange." The translation devices worked perfectly, but the word dialogue seemed to confuse many of the aliens. Several species began murmuring among themselves, trying to understand why a military exposition would focus on talking instead of fighting. Admiral Kethvar's laughter rumbled through his translator like distant thunder. "Dialogue? Little human. This is a display of military strength, not a poetry reading. Tell us about your fleets, your weapons, your conquests. How many ships defend your worlds? Surely not just those 12 toys we saw floating outside." More laughter rippled through the hall as holographic displays showed the tiny human vessels docked at the station. Compared to the kilometer-long dreadnoughts and living crystal bioships, they looked like children's models. Captain Park Min-ho stood to answer, his posture straight and professional. "We find that quality is more important than quantity in all things, Admiral. Our vessels serve their purpose effectively." The hall erupted in barely contained mirth. Even the mechanical Collective's robots seemed to process this statement as humor, its optical sensors flickering in what might have been mechanical amusement. The crystalline Overmind's colors shifted to patterns that suggested gentle mockery, while the Flame Dancers actually began making crackling sounds that served as their version of laughter. Commander Vexthul leaned forward in his seat, his scales shifting to colors that showed he was enjoying himself. Perhaps Earth requires protection from the more aggressive species in this sector. The Collective offers very reasonable rates for system defense contracts. We could have a security fleet in your space within a standard month. Several other delegates nodded in agreement, seeing an opportunity to gain a new client species. The galaxy was full of small civilizations that paid tribute to larger powers in exchange for protection from pirates, raiders, and conquest fleets. Lee Hyeri rose from her seat with a gentle smile that never wavered despite the mockery filling the hall. "That's very generous of you, Commander, but such protection won't be necessary. Earth prefers to handle its own security arrangements." This brought even more laughter. The idea that a species with 12 tiny ships could defend itself against any of the military powers present was beyond ridiculous. It was like watching a mouse claim it could fight off a pack of wolves. "Security arrangements," roared a delegate from the Bone Crushers, a species that looked like walking skeletons covered in spikes. What security can you possibly provide with vessels smaller than our fighter craft? Perhaps they have powerful allies we don't know about, suggested a representative from the Plasma Weavers, though his tone made it clear he was joking. Kim Ji-ho remained calm throughout the mockery, his expression never changing from polite attention. When the laughter finally died down, he simply said, "Earth has always believed in being prepared for any situation. We hope this gathering will lead to better understanding between all our peoples." The Void Hunter delegate, who had remained silent throughout the presentations, suddenly spoke in a voice like grinding stone. "Understanding comes through strength. The weak are consumed by the strong. This is the way of the galaxy." "Perhaps," Kim replied peacefully, "but we've found that strength comes in many forms." This brought renewed laughter from the assembly. The humans were clearly naive newcomers who didn't understand how the real galaxy worked. Power came from big ships, powerful weapons, and the will to use them. Everything else was just wishful thinking from species too weak to survive on their own. As the human delegation returned to their seats, delegates throughout the hall continued their quiet conversations about how quickly this new species would be conquered or absorbed by one of the major powers. None of them could imagine that within days, their entire understanding of galactic power would be turned upside down. The news spread through Kepler Prime like wildfire. 3 days after the humans had embarrassed themselves in the assembly hall, long-range sensors picked up something that made every alien delegate rush to their observation posts. Admiral Kethvar had done exactly what everyone expected. He was moving to claim human space for the Zephyrian Empire. The sensor readings were incredible. 300 Zephyrian warships were racing through hyperspace toward Earth, led by Kethvar's personal flagship, the Eternal Dominion. This massive vessel was twice the size of his regular dreadnoughts, covered in so many weapons that it looked like a flying fortress made of death itself. Its hull was painted deep crimson with golden stripes, and energy fields crackled around it like captured lightning. Word spread quickly through the station's corridors and meeting rooms. Aliens who had been competitors just hours before now gathered together to watch what promised to be the shortest military conquest in galactic history. The observation decks filled with excited delegates, all eager to see how quickly the naive humans would surrender. "I give them 10 minutes after the fleet arrives," laughed a representative from the Acid Spitters, a species that looked like giant mantises with dripping fangs. "These humans don't even understand what real warfare looks like." 10 minutes? "You're being generous," replied a bone-crusher diplomat, his skeletal frame rattling with amusement. "I say they'll surrender the moment they see our ships dropping from hyperspace. One look at the Eternal Dominion and they'll be begging for mercy." Commander Vex Thul stood near the main viewing window, his scales shifting through nervous colors as he watched the tactical displays. The Zephyrian fleet was massive, enough firepower to crack planets and boil oceans. Against this, the humans had 12 tiny ships that looked like they were held together with hope and good intentions. The crystalline Overmind floated nearby, its rainbow form pulsing with what seemed like anticipation. "The mathematical probability of human victory is so small that our calculators cannot process it," the creature sang in its bell-like voice. "Perhaps we will learn something about how primitive species face their final moments." Even the usually silent Void Hunters had gathered to watch, their shadow ships visible as dark blots against the starfield. When these creatures showed interest in something, it usually meant death was coming soon. On the station's main observation deck, Kim Ji-ho stood calmly beside Captain Park Min-ho, watching the tactical display that showed the approaching Zephyrian fleet. The holographic readout painted a terrifying picture, wave after wave of massive warships, their weapons already charging for battle. Any sane military commander would be frantically preparing escape routes or composing surrender messages. Instead, the humans seemed almost relaxed. Kim Ji-ho sipped tea from a simple ceramic cup while reviewing diplomatic reports on his tablet. Captain Park stood with his hands clasped behind his back, studying the tactical display with the calm attention of someone watching a weather report. Lee Hieri sat nearby, working on what appeared to be routine paperwork. "Sir," called out Lieutenant Kim Subin from the communications station, "we're receiving a transmission from the Zephyrian flagship. "Put it through," Park replied without turning away from the display. The main screen flickered to life, showing Admiral Kethvar in all his terrifying glory. The alien commander sat on a throne made from the bones of his enemies, his red eyes glowing with the fires of conquest. Behind him, the bridge of the Eternal Dominion bustled with activity as his crew prepared for battle. Attention, primitive. "Humans," Kethvar's voice boomed through the speakers, the translation making his words sound like grinding metal. "I am Admiral Kethvar of the Zephyrian Empire, commander of the greatest fleet in this sector. You have exactly 1 hour to surrender unconditionally. Submit now, and I will allow your homeworld to survive as a slave colony. Resist, and I will turn your sun into a funeral pyre that will be seen from across the galaxy." The alien observers throughout the station held their breath, waiting for the humans to collapse in terror. Some had recording devices ready to capture the moment when another primitive species learned their place in the galactic order. Instead, Captain Park simply activated his comm unit with the casual gesture of someone answering a routine call. "This is Captain Park Minho of the Terran naval ship Resilience. Admiral Kethvar, your message has been received and reviewed. Our response is negative on the surrender demand. We strongly suggest you reconsider your current course of action." Silence filled the observation deck like a physical weight. The alien delegates stared at each other in complete shock. Had the human actually just refused the surrender demand? Was he completely insane? Admiral Kethavar's roar of rage echoed through the speakers, making several smaller aliens scramble for cover. "You dare refuse the might of the Zephyrian Empire? You pathetic insects will burn for this insolence. I will personally feed your ashes to my war beasts." "That's unfortunate," Park replied in the same calm tone he might use to discuss the weather. "We had hoped for a peaceful resolution to this situation." The communication cut off as Kethvar apparently became too angry to continue speaking. Throughout the observation areas, aliens were whispering frantically among themselves, trying to understand what they had just witnessed. "Have they lost their minds?" asked a Plasma Weaver delegate, his energy form crackling with confusion. "Do they not understand what 300 Zephyrian warships can do to their tiny fleet?" Commander Vexthul found himself studying the human captain more closely. There was something about Park's complete calm that didn't make sense. This wasn't the behavior of someone facing certain death. It was the confidence of someone who knew something the rest of them didn't. "Perhaps they're incredibly brave," suggested a representative from the Singing Crystals, though her melodic voice carried notes of doubt. "Perhaps they're incredibly stupid," countered the bone-crusher diplomat. "Perhaps both," Vexthul muttered. But something about the situation was making his combat instincts tingle with warning. In his experience, when an enemy showed this kind of confidence in the face of overwhelming odds, it usually meant they had a very nasty surprise waiting. The Mechanical Collective's robot delegate processed the interaction with mechanical precision, calculating probability of human survival against Zephyrian fleet. Result, 0.001%. Conclusion, humans are operating on flawed data or possess hidden military assets. That last part made several aliens pause. Hidden military assets. What could the humans possibly be hiding with their 12 tiny ships? The tactical display updated as the Zephyrian fleet prepared to drop from hyperspace directly into human space. Weapon systems were charging, boarding parties were suiting up, and conquest banners were being unfurled. This was going to be the most one-sided battle in galactic history. Lee Hieri looked up from her paperwork and walked over to join the captain at the viewing window. "The fleet will be dropping from hyperspace in approximately 6 hours," she reported. "All Terran vessels are in position and ready to respond." "Acknowledged," Park replied, then turned to Kim Jiho. "Ambassador, you might want to send a final diplomatic message to Admiral Kethvar. Standard protocols." Kim nodded and walked to the communication station. As he began composing what everyone assumed would be a desperate plea for mercy, the 12 human ships continued their slow patrol around Kepler Prime, showing no signs of panic, retreat, or preparation for the overwhelming force heading their way. The alien observers settled in to watch what they were certain would be humanity's final hour as an independent species. None of them could imagine that within a few short hours, Their entire understanding of military power was about to be shattered by the species they had spent days mocking as primitive weaklings. The moment had finally arrived. Admiral Kethvar stood on the bridge of the Eternal Dominion, his crimson eyes gleaming with anticipation as his fleet prepared to drop from hyperspace. Around him, 300 of the most powerful warships in the galaxy hummed with deadly energy. Plasma cannons charged with electric blue fire, missile tubes loaded with planet crackers, and energy shields flickered to life across hulls designed for total destruction. "All ships report ready for combat," announced his tactical officer, a scarred veteran whose own scales bore the marks of 100 battles. "Target coordinates locked. The human homeworld will burn within the hour." Kethavar's fanged mouth twisted into a cruel smile. "Execute hyperspace exit. Let these insects see what real power looks like before they die." Space itself seemed to ripple and tear as 300 massive warships materialized in human space. The Eternal Dominion led the formation like a crimson mountain of death, its weapon systems already targeting the pathetic human defenders. Behind it, dreadnoughts, battlecruisers, and destroyer squadrons spread out in perfect attack formation, their combined firepower capable of sterilizing entire star systems. But something was wrong. Instead of cowering in terror or attempting to flee, the 12 tiny human vessels had arranged themselves in a neat line facing the Zephyrian armada. They looked like toys compared to the kilometer-long monsters bearing down on them, but they showed no signs of panic or retreat. "Sir," the tactical officer said, his voice uncertain, "the human ships they're doing something strange." Kethvar focused his attention on the scanner displays, and what he saw made his blood run cold. Each of the 12 human vessels was opening like a flower, their hull plates retracting to reveal compartments that seemed far too large to fit inside such small ships. And from these compartments, smaller craft were emerging. At first, it was just a few dozen sleek fighters, each one no bigger than a Zephyrian shuttle. The alien crew began to laugh, thinking the humans were deploying their entire fighter wing in a desperate last stand. But the laughter died as more ships kept coming. Hundreds of fighters streamed from each human vessel, followed by frigates, corvettes and destroyers that seemed to unfold from spaces that shouldn't exist. "How?" whispered the tactical officer, his claws clicking nervously on his control panel. "How are they fitting so many ships inside those tiny hulls?" The answer became clear as the human vessels began their full transformation. What had appeared to be simple escort ships suddenly revealed their true nature. Hull sections slid apart like puzzle pieces, extending on mechanical arms that reached far into space, internal compartments that had been compressed by some impossible technology expanded to their full size, revealing massive foundries, construction bays, and manufacturing facilities. The 12 ships weren't escort vessels at all. They were mobile shipyards, each one a marvel of engineering that defied everything the galaxy thought it knew about physics and space construction. Robotic arms as long as Zephyrian destroyers began assembling new vessels from streams of raw matter that seemed to appear from nowhere. The construction process was so fast it looked like magic. Frames appearing in seconds, hulls forming around them like living metal, weapon systems installing themselves with mechanical precision. "This is impossible," Kethvar snarled, watching, as his tactical display filled with more and more enemy contacts. "They're violating the fundamental laws of space and matter," but the impossible was happening right before his eyes. Each human shipyard was producing vessels at a rate that made no sense. What should have taken months or years of construction was happening in minutes. Fighters rolled off assembly lines like products from a factory, while larger ships grew from nothing like crystal formations in fast forward. Captain Park's voice crackled across the communication channel, as calm and steady as ever. "Admiral Kethvar, this is your final warning. Withdraw your forces from human space immediately." "Final warning?" Kethvar roared, his rage making the bridge lights flicker. "You're outnumbered 300 to 12. Surrender now or face complete annihilation." "Actually," Park replied with what sounded like mild amusement, "you might want to check your tactical display again." Kethvar's eyes snapped to the scanner readout, and his heart nearly stopped. The human fleet was growing exponentially. What had started as 12 tiny vessels was now hundreds of ships, then thousands, sleek destroyers with hulls that seemed to bend light around them. fighters that moved in perfect formation like schools of metallic fish, frigates bristling with weapons that his computers couldn't identify. "Sir," his tactical officer called out, his voice cracking with panic. "Enemy ship count is now over 2,000 and still rising. They're producing vessels faster than our sensors can track them." The human shipyards were like nothing anyone had ever seen. They didn't just build ships, they seemed to create them from pure energy and compressed matter. Construction beams reached out into space, gathering cosmic dust and asteroid fragments, converting them instantly into refined metals and composite materials. The process was so efficient that the shipyards were actually cleaning up the space around them while building an entire fleet. But it wasn't just the number of ships that terrified the Zephyrian crews. It was the technology they were seeing. The human vessels moved in ways that violated known physics, turning at angles that should have torn them apart, accelerating at speeds that should have liquefied their crews. Their weapon signatures didn't match anything in the galactic database, and their hulls seemed to shift and adapt as the sensors tried to scan them. "Energy readings are off the charts," reported the sensor operator, his voice barely a whisper. "Sir, each of those human frigates is showing power output equivalent to our heavy cruisers, and they're still building more." Within 6 hours, the impossible had become reality. The Zephyrian fleet, which had arrived expecting to face 12 tiny defenders, now found itself staring at over 3,000 human warships. The odds had completely reversed. Admiral Kethvar's mighty armada was now outnumbered 10 to 1 by an enemy that seemed to create warships from thin air. "How?" Kethvar whispered, his earlier confidence completely shattered. "How is this possible?" His answer came from an unexpected source. The Mechanical Collective's robot delegate, monitoring the battle from Kepler Prime, transmitted a cold analysis across all frequencies. Hypothesis: human vessels utilize compression technology beyond current galactic understanding. Each ship contains manufacturing capabilities equivalent to entire planetary industrial complexes. Conclusion: previous assessment of human military capacity was severely flawed. The newly constructed human fleet began moving into formation with mechanical precision that impressed even the robots. Each vessel took its assigned position without confusion or delay, creating attack patterns that looked like deadly mathematical equations written across the stars. Their coordination was perfect, as if thousands of individual ships were actually parts of a single massive organism. Captain Park's voice came across the communication channel one final time, still carrying that same calm confidence that had puzzled the aliens from the beginning. "Admiral, you now have 30 minutes to begin your withdrawal from human space. Any vessel that remains after that time will be considered hostile and dealt with accordingly." The threat hung in space like a physical weight. Around Admiral Kethvar, his bridge crew looked to him for orders, their earlier confidence replaced by fear and confusion. They had come expecting easy conquest, and found themselves facing an enemy that had just redefined what was possible in galactic warfare. For the first time in his long military career, Admiral Kethvar found himself completely outmatched by an opponent he had dismissed as primitive. The humans had revealed their true nature, not through boasting or threats, but through a demonstration of technological superiority, so overwhelming that it left the greatest military mind in the Zephyrian Empire speechless. The galaxy was about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't firepower or numbers. It was the ability to appear weak until the moment they chose to show their true strength. The retreat began slowly, then turned into a complete rout. Admiral Kethvar's mighty eternal dominion, the terror of a dozen star systems, powered down its weapons and began backing away from the human fleet. One by one, the 300 Zephyrian warships that had arrived with such confidence began their shameful withdrawal from human space. The news traveled faster than light itself. Within hours, every species in the galaxy knew what had happened. The Zephyrian Empire, the most feared military force in known space, had been completely outmatched by 12 tiny human vessels. Sensor recordings of the battle spread like wildfire through diplomatic channels, showing the impossible transformation of the human ships and the birth of a fleet that defied all known laws of physics and engineering. Back at Kepler Prime, the Mood in the Grand Assembly Hall had changed completely. The same delegates who had been laughing at the humans just days before now sat in stunned silence, watching the tactical displays that showed the Zephyrian retreat. The holographic images painted a story that nobody wanted to believe, but couldn't deny. Humanity had just become the most powerful military force in the galaxy overnight. The crystalline Overmind's rainbow form flickered with colors that had never been seen before. Patterns that suggested confusion and fear mixed together. The mechanical collective's robots stood perfectly still, their processors working overtime to recalculate every assumption they had made about galactic power. Structures. Even the Void Hunters seemed less dark, as if the shadows they carried had been diminished by what they had witnessed. When Ambassador Kim Ji-ho was called to address the assembly once again, the atmosphere was completely different. The massive Hell fell silent as he walked to the central platform, his simple blue uniform looking somehow more impressive now that everyone understood what it represented. Gone were the whispers and quiet laughter. Instead, thousands of alien eyes watched his every movement, with the respect usually reserved for gods or natural disasters. "Honored friends," Kim began, his voice carrying the same calm tone he had. "Used throughout the crisis, humanity has always believed in proportional response. We build what we need when we need it, nothing more, nothing less." The simplicity of the statement made it even more terrifying. The humans hadn't been trying to show off or intimidate anyone. They had simply responded to a threat with exactly the amount of force necessary to neutralize it. The implications were staggering. If this was their idea of a proportional response, what would happen if someone actually made them angry? Lee Hyeri stepped forward, her datapad glowing with technical specifications that would have been dismissed as fantasy just hours earlier. "Each of our vessels contains fabrication matrices capable of exponential production scaling," she explained, in the matter-of-fact tone of someone discussing the weather. "What you witnessed during the Zephyrian encounter was a minor deployment, representing roughly 0.3% of our rapid response capability." The number hit the assembled delegates like a physical blow. 0.3%. The fleet that had just forced the retreat of 300 Zephyrian dreadnoughts was less than half of 1% of humanity's immediate response capability. The mathematics were simple enough for even the most primitive species to understand, and the results were terrifying. If 0.3% of their capability could produce 3,000 warships in 6 hours, what could they do with their full manufacturing potential? The numbers became so large that most species couldn't even comprehend them. Millions of ships? Billions? The human woman standing before them had just casually mentioned that her species could potentially produce fleets larger than the combined military forces of the entire galaxy. Commander Vex Thul was the first to break the stunned silence that followed Lee's revelation. The reptilian warrior, whose scales had been shifting through nervous patterns since the news of the Zephyrian retreat, stood up from his seat and spoke in a voice that carried throughout the hall. "The Mechanical Collective formally requests a non-aggression treaty with Terra," he announced, his words carefully chosen to show maximum respect. "We wish to establish peaceful diplomatic relations with humanity and recognize their sovereign right to defend their territory." It was like a dam breaking. Before Vexthul had even finished speaking, delegates throughout the hall were rising to their feet, calling out their own requests for treaties, trade agreements, and diplomatic recognition. The crystalline Overmind's song took on pleading tones, as it offered to share advanced crystal-growing technology. The Flame Dancers promised to provide safe passage through their territory for all human vessels. Even the Bone Crushers, who had spent centuries conquering weaker species, offered to serve as mercenaries in humanity's service. The Void Hunters, who rarely spoke to anyone, transmitted a simple message directly to the human delegation. "The Pi. Darkness acknowledges the light. We will not enter your space." For species that had spent millennia fighting over territory and resources, the sudden unanimity was unprecedented. Within 3 hours of Lee's presentation, every major power in the galaxy had formally requested peaceful relations with humanity. The Galactic Council, which usually took months to agree on simple trade regulations, unanimously established something that had never existed before: the Terran Respect Zone. This wasn't just a no-fly zone or a diplomatic buffer. It was a vast sphere of space, stretching across dozens of star systems where human interests would be considered completely inviolate. Any ship entering the zone would require human permission. Any conflict near the zone would be mediated by human diplomats. Any threat to human citizens anywhere in the galaxy would be treated as an act of war against every member species of the Council. The speed of the decision-making process was almost as impressive as the human fleet demonstration. Species that had been enemies for centuries were now working together to make sure they stayed on humanity's good side. Trade routes were being rerouted to avoid accidentally entering human space. Military exercises were being cancelled if they might be interpreted as threatening to human interests. As the emergency session of the Galactic Council concluded, the human delegation prepared to return to their ships. The same 12 vessels that had been mocked as toys just days earlier were now viewed with a mixture of awe and terror by every alien in the station. Military analysts from dozens of species were studying every available image of the human ships, trying to understand technology that seemed to operate on principles beyond their comprehension. Captain Park Minho stood on the observation deck of Kepler Prime, watching as alien fleets maintained carefully respectful distances from the human vessels. Ships that could have easily destroyed the station were giving the tiny human craft a berth of several thousand kilometers, their captains terrified of accidentally being perceived as aggressive. Lee Hieri joined him at the viewing window, her datapad displaying incoming intelligence reports from across the galaxy. "The reports are flooding in from every corner of known space," she said, scrolling through diplomatic messages, trade requests, and military assessments. "Everyone wants to know what other surprises we might have hidden among the stars. The Flame Dancers are asking about our defensive capabilities. The Mechanical Collective wants to know about our manufacturing techniques. Even the Crystalline Overmind is curious about our compression technology." Park smiled, watching as a Zephyrian destroyer that had been part of Kethavar's original force carefully adjusted its course to give the human ships even more space. "Let them wonder," he said quietly. "Sometimes the greatest strength lies not in what you show, but in what you keep hidden. The galaxy has seen a tiny fraction of what humanity is capable of, and that's exactly how we want it." The psychological impact was already visible. Alien crews were moving with careful precision around anything that might be connected to humanity. Diplomatic pouches addressed to human space were being handled like precious artifacts. Even pirate and raider groups were avoiding systems anywhere near human territory, afraid of accidentally triggering a response from the species that had just redefined the concept of overwhelming force. As the 12 ships of humanity's tiny fleet began their journey home, they left behind a galaxy forever changed. The old power structures based on size, numbers, and brute force had been shattered in a single day. In their place was a new understanding. The quiet species from the blue planet in the outer spiral arm were not to be underestimated, threatened, or ignored. The galaxy would never again mistake human restraint for human weakness. And in the depths of space, on worlds scattered across 1,000 star systems, military planners and political leaders asked themselves the same terrifying question. If 12 small ships could do this, what else might humanity be hiding in the darkness between the stars? The end.